want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly.
Peaceful protest.
Peaceful protesters.
Peaceful protest.
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 Good evening. I'm Robert Cressionnie. Thanks for tuning in to America in Danger. Today is May 15th, 2021. Now, tonight's show is a little bit different because I wasn't able to get into the studio, so we're not doing a live show tonight. This is pre-recorded. And I'm going to show a series of videos. And the first video is from Liberty International. And it's a video, it's an animated video. And it talks about the principles of individual liberty. And it's very important to understand these things because this is what's being attacked so strongly by the left, by the media, by various groups across the country. Individual liberty is so important because when the individual is protected, then everyone is protected because everyone is the individual. When we pick groups to protect and look after, then there are those who are excluded from those groups and who don't have the luxury of the protections afforded to those groups or the opportunities given to those groups. So individual liberty is really one of the most foundational principles of this nation. This video, I think, is about 8 minutes. Maybe 10 minutes. Take a look at this. Pay attention because it's all text. There are no words to this video, but it's very important that we understand this. And it's very important that our children understand this as they come up through the school system, especially if they are in the government schools. But it applies just as well to the private schools too. So take a look at this, and I'll be back after this. You're watching America in Danger. Stay tuned. thanks for staying tuned to America in Danger. I'm Robert Cressionnie, and that video is very powerful, and it's very important that we understand those principles. If you want to watch that video again, you can go to YouTube and search for the Philosophy of Liberty, and it is by the Liberty International Organization, and they put some thought into it, and I like that video. I was very moved when I saw that video the first time. Now, we talk on this show a lot about politicians, government, the trust that is really lacking when it comes to politics and politicians and constituencies. You know, I consider politicians to be one of the probably least reliable groups of professionals. And actually, statistically, politicians have the highest incidence of criminal activity of any professional group. So when they say, trust me or count on me or you can count on me, well, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. But, you know, there's a lot of talk about Social Security and a lot of speculation and whether it will be solvent when we start drawing our Social Security. Now, Social Security is not, or at least it wasn't intended to be, a giveaway. It was an investment where people paid in and businesses paid in on top of what people paid in, what the individual paid in. And you were supposed to accrue value there so that you could draw that out in your old age. Well, now they've converted it pretty much to just payouts to people who have never paid a dime into the system. And it's really criminal what they've done. And, you know, we have politicians who demand pay raises periodically, vote themselves pay raises. And yet, people who work their whole lives and paid into Social Security, they get crumbs. So take a look at this. This video is put out by a group called Special Ops TV. And that's interesting. Special Ops TV. Now, this is nothing fancy, but it definitely summarizes what has happened to Social Security over time. And I'll come back and talk a little bit more about this after the video. So take a look at this and stay tuned. You're watching America in Danger.
Social Security History of Betrayal. Just in case some of you young whippersnappers, and some older ones, didn't know this. It's easy to check out if you don't believe it. Be sure and show it to your family and friends. They need a little history lesson on what's what, and it doesn't matter whether you are Democrat or Republican. Facts are facts. Social Security cards up until the 1980s expressly stated the number and card were not to be used for identification purposes. Since nearly everyone in the United States now has a number, it became convenient to use it anyway, and the message, "not for identification," was removed. Our Social Security. Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, introduced the Social Security FICA program. He promised, 1, that participation in the program would be completely voluntary. No longer voluntary. 2, that the participants would only have to pay 1% of the first $1,400 of their annual incomes into the program. Now, 7.65% on the first $90,000. 3, that the money the participants elected to put into the program would be deductible from their income for tax purposes each year. No longer tax deductible. 4, that the money the participants put into the independent trust fund rather than into the general operating fund, and therefore would only be used to fund the Social Security retirement program and no other government program, and under Johnson, the money was moved to the general fund and spent. 5, that the annuity payments to the retirees would never be taxed as income. Under Clinton and Gore, up to 85% of your Social Security can be taxed. Since many of us have paid into FICA for years and are now receiving a Social Security check each month, and then finding that we're getting taxed on 85% of the money we paid into the federal government to put away, you may be interested in the following. Which political party took Social Security from the Independent Trust Fund and put it into the general fund so that Congress could spend it? It was Lyndon Johnson and the democratically controlled House and Senate. Which political party eliminated the income tax deduction for Social Security FICA withholding? The Democratic Party. Which political party started taxing Social Security annuities? The Democratic Party, with Al Gore casting the tie-breaking deciding vote as President of the Senate while he was Vice President of the United States. Which political party decided to start giving annuity payments to immigrants? And my favorite, that's right, Jimmy Carter and the Democratic Party. Immigrants moved into this country and at age 65 began to receive Social Security payments. The Democratic Party gave these payments to them, and even though they never paid a dime into it. Then after violating the original contract, FICA, the Democrats turn around and tell you that the Republicans want to take your Social Security away. And the worst part about it is uninformed citizens believe it. If enough people receive this, maybe a seed of awareness will be planted and maybe changes will evolve. But it's worth a try. How many people can you send this to? Actions speak louder than bumper stickers. Please do keep this one rolling across the country. Hopefully it will open a few eyes.
All right, we've got to take a little commercial break, and after that, I'll be back with more America in Danger. Stay tuned.
Hey, this is John Woodruff with Premier Equipment Company of Rocky Mountain Infield. You've been shopping for a zero-turn mower lately. You've probably noticed that inventory is getting hard to come by. So come on down and see what we've got. We've got a showroom full. We have a showroom full of Exmark and Grasshopper zero-turn mowers. Everything from commercial to residential, everything in between. We've got good relationship with our distributors. They tell us when we sell these, they've got more on the way. If you've been in the market for a zero-turn mower, come see me, John Woodruff from Premier Equipment.
Premier Equipment is open during the week from 8 to 5:30 and on the weekends from 8 to 12.
Are you afraid to answer the phone because of bill collectors? A Chapter 13 plan can help. Chapter 13 allows people with too many bills to work out a debt repayment plan under federal law. It helps you control your debts instead of your debts controlling you. Chapter 13 stops creditors from harassing you and stops repossessions and foreclosures. It allows you to answer the phone again without fear or worry. Call H. Frank Allen, Attorney at Law, a debt relief agency providing bankruptcy relief under the Bankruptcy Code.
We're back, and I thought that was a rather interesting video on the what's been done to Social Security over the years. Now, the main focus was on the Democrat Party, and we know that it was Democrat Congresses that did most of these things, but we can't simply say it was only the Democrats. Because the Republicans were right there too, and if you look back at those votes, there were plenty of Republicans who supported doing these things as well. So the Republicans are not squeaky clean on this, and don't ever think so. Don't ever think that one party is looking out for you and taking your best interest to heart, because they don't. Because they sell out ultimately one way or another. They let things happen. They don't go on the offensive. They let things creep through, slide through, and they tell you, we're gonna fight this. We're gonna get to the bottom of this. They hold hearings. They do all of that, and whatever comes of it, nothing. In fact, Lindsey Graham, he is notorious for saying, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to hold hearings on this, and nothing ever comes of it. So, politicians are very often rules for thee and privilege for me. And we saw this very blatantly when the COVID pandemic was cranking up. One in particular, and the Michigan GOP has put out a video about Governor Whitmer in Michigan, and I thought it was hilarious myself. But I thought it was also very much on target, and the fact checkers can't even deny these things because this is what happened. So I want you to take a look at this video by the Michigan GOP. It's only a couple minutes, I think. It's not very long at all, but take a look at this, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the next one coming up. So you're watching America in Danger. I'm Robert Cressionnie.
Here in Michigan, we sacrifice and do the right thing for our fellow Michiganders. When Governor Whitmer mandated we cancel vacations and weddings to help stop COVID-19, we did it. When forced to visit our loved ones through glass windows, as hard as it was, we listened. If, however, you are the governor and you really want to see your family in Florida, because we all miss our families, then go ahead. And if you get caught, just lie. If the governor says no spring break this year, then that goes for all of us. Except, of course, if you are the person in the governor's office who is in charge of vaccine distribution and needing a girl's trip to Florida, then have a good time. Don't worry about failing to fill out the state's vaccine order, missing the deadline to get an additional 360,000 doses during a massive COVID surge. Your tan will be on point this summer. And as much as we all want to get a condo in sunny Gulf Shores, Alabama, we should heed Whitmer's advice. Unless you're her public health director, then bon voyage. Remember, Michigan, we are all in this together. We play by the rules. Unless you're Governor Whitmer or work for Whitmer. And in that case, play by your own rules. Pure hypocrisy. Pure Whitmer.
All right, we're back, and I think Governor Whitmer is probably, no, I'm not going to say that, because many politicians have no shame. They do these things. If they're caught red-handed, they might cry a little bit, they might apologize, but really they have no remorse because they go on doing these things. And Governor Whitmer is one of the many who sees her position as one of privilege by doing things. And they left out some things. When the COVID crisis, when they first locked everything down, her husband called up to the lake and demanded that his boat be put on the water because they were coming to the lake that weekend. Now, these things happened. They're not speculation. They're not someone making this up. It's not propaganda. It's not hyperbole. These things happened. And they did exactly that. And this is so much the case of rules for thee, but not for me. So, and journalists ignore these things. The journalists simply, what they call journalists now, I won't even give them the dignity of actually calling them journalists, because they're really not. They're a bunch of hacks. They act all high and mighty, but in reality, they're just a bunch of hacks who push an agenda and take their marching orders from higher up. Now, the BBC is regarded by some as being impartial and fair and covering every angle. Well, I think that's hogwash myself. BBC is as biased as any other media outlet. Now, a BBC correspondent interviewed the Azerbaijani president, Aliyev. Now, I'm not sticking up for the guy. I'm not saying he's pure as a driven snow. I'm not saying that he hasn't committed some things that probably border on war crimes. I don't know. I can't say. I know that those areas of the world are harsh and governments are harsh. But the BBC is just like every other media outlet. They love to point the finger. They love to accuse. They love to try and get that gotcha moment, that gotcha question. We saw that for 4 years during the Trump administration, always with the gotcha questions. Now, during the Biden administration, we're not seeing that. What we're seeing is softball questions. Oh, how are you feeling today, Uncle Joe? We're seeing ridiculous things like that being asked. We're not seeing the hard questions asked. We're not seeing the questions about Hunter's laptop or the Ukrainian influence or the Chinese influence or what's going on at the border. President and Vice President haven't even been to the border, and the Vice President is supposed to be in charge of that crisis. But anyway, take a look at this video. This video is about a BBC correspondent who really gets her comeuppance by President Aliyev. Now, for whatever he's done, I'm not sticking up for the guy. I'm not saying he's good. But what he says, in the context that he says it, is right on the money. He hit the nail square on the head with this one. So take a look at this and tell me if you don't agree that this journalist got her comeuppance, and rightly so.
We already talked about Armenian civilians. We have nothing wrong, in communications with them. And I said many times, and I think what I say, I keep the word, that after we liberate the territory from these criminal gangs which occupied our territory, Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh will live much better. They will have more salaries because the salary in Azerbaijan is higher, more pensions because pension in Azerbaijan is 3 times higher in Armenia. They will have all the social protection. We will invest in those areas largely. Will
they have the full range of human rights which people here in Azerbaijan do not have? Will they have a fully free media? Will they have an opposition that's allowed to raise its voice? Will they be allowed to have things that people here in Azerbaijan do not have?
You think they do not have it? Why do you think that people in Azerbaijan do not have free media and opposition?
Because this is what I'm told by independent sources in this country.
Which independent sources?
Many independent sources.
Tell me which.
I certainly couldn't name sources.
Oh, if you couldn't name, that means that you're just inventing the story.
So you're saying the media is not under state control?
Not at all.
And there is a vibrant, free opposition media? Where do I see this?
You can see it in the internet. You can see it everywhere.
But not in newspapers?
Why? You can see it in newspapers. Whom do you call opposition here? Can I ask you?
Well, is there allowed to be an opposition here?
Yeah, it is allowed, of course.
I mean, NGOs are the subject of a crackdown. Journalists are the subject of a crackdown.
Not at all.
Critics are in jail.
No, not at all.
None of this is true.
Absolutely fake. Absolutely. We have free media. We have free internet. Now, due to the martial law, we have some restrictions. But before, there have been no restrictions. And the number of internet users in Azerbaijan is more than 80%. Can you imagine the restriction of media in a country where internet is free, there is no censorship, and there are 80% of internet users? We have millions of people on Facebook. How can you say that we don't have free media? This is, again, a biased approach. This is an attempt to create a perception in Western audience about Azerbaijan. We have opposition, we have NGOs, we have free political activity, we have free media, we have freedom of speech. But if you raise this question, can I ask you also one? How do you assess what happened to Mr. Assange? Is it a reflection of free media in your country?
We're not here to discuss my country. No,
let's discuss.
No, President
In order to accuse me, saying that Armenians will not have free media here, let's talk about Assange. How many years he spent in Ecuadorian embassy, and for what? And where is he now? For journalistic activity. You kept that person hostage, actually killing him morally and physically. You did it, not us, and now he's in prison. So you have no moral right to talk about free media when you do these things.
Returning to the conflict, how
Yeah,
long...
better return to the conflict, because this is not what you like. You like only to accuse, only to attack. But look at the mirror. Look, I tell many times, before coming and lecturing us, and in your question, accusing me, it's not a question, it's accusation. You talk like a prosecutor. Why? If you're so democratic and so objective, why you keep Assange in prison? For what? You keep him in prison because of his journalistic activity.
I'm not keeping him in prison, President Aliyev. But
You don't like this.
It's not a question of don't like.
You are not used to this.
It's not the
because
subject
you are
of our
used
interview.
only to attack.
It's not the subject of our interview. And with respect,
No,
President
it is not the
Aliyev,
subject of interview, but you raise it.
you raised it.
No, you raised it.
You raised the case
You
of
said
Assange.
Armenians, if you don't have a free media in your country, how Armenians can live without opposition? That was your accusation.
You've
All right, we've got to take a little commercial break, and after that, I'll be back with more America in Danger. Stay tuned.
This is Nicholas Bellamy at Premier Equipment. I'm going to talk about the 4540 Mahindra. It's 38 horsepower, full cylinder engine. The weight of this tractor is 4,000 pounds. This tractor is perfect for bush hogging, distance, small garden, a hunting club tractor. Comes with a 7-year warranty, 2-year bumper to bumper, additional 5-year on the powertrain. You can have this tractor for $200 a month, and we have 20 of these tractors in stock. Premier Equipment is open during the week from 8 to 5:30 and on the weekends from 8 to 12.
Sees things with such clarity when the media and politicians can cloud the issue so dramatically. Thomas Sowell cuts through with logic, with knowledge, with understanding.
It happens to me all the time, and it happened just this week. A young person I'd never met introduced himself to me and said that when he saw our guest today on an earlier episode of this program, he felt he was seeing a man who knew how to think. Dr. Thomas Sowell on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Thomas Sowell has studied and taught economics, intellectual history, and social policy at institutions that include Cornell, Brandeis, UCLA, and Amherst. Now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. Sowell has published more than a dozen books, including the classic A Conflict of Visions. Coming soon, a revised edition of his most recent volume, Discrimination and Disparities. Tom Sowell, welcome.
Thank you.
You grew up in Harlem, dropped out of high school to join the Marine Corps during the Korean War, received an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a master's from Columbia, and your doctorate from the University of Chicago, all of which pales by comparison with the fact that you once tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers. But during this period, from Harlem to the University of Chicago, throughout your 20s, you've said, you spent most of the decade of your 20s as a Marxist.
Yes.
Why? What was the attraction?
Well, I guess I first was very puzzled. See, there's one little correction I would make. At age 16, I was a dropout, high school dropout, and I went to work full time as a Western Union messenger.
Delivering telegrams.
Delivering telegrams.
We better say that because there will be a generation that won't know what Western Union was. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's true too.
Right.
And so I worked in the area of Manhattan called the Chelsea District, which is around 23rd Street, 9th Avenue. And at the end of the day, I had several ways of getting back home. The easiest, fastest way was with a subway, which was a nickel in those days. When I was feeling flush, I might go for a bus for a dime. And then when I was really getting reckless, I would take the Fifth Avenue bus, which was the elite of the buses, was 15 cents. And so I would walk over to Fifth Avenue, take that bus. And it would take me up through all the glamorous parts of Fifth Avenue, past the Empire State Building, past the great stores and things of that sort. And then on 57th Street, it would turn, and this is just the elite part of town.
Sure, right there where the park starts.
Yes, and then the park starts at 59th.
Oh, sorry.
57th, I would turn over, again, the same kind of scene, past Carnegie Hall.
Right.
Up Columbus Circle, there was no Trump Tower at that time, and on up to about 72nd Street, and go out to Fifth Avenue, out to Riverside Drive, which is another elite area. And so for miles after that, you'd have all these wonderful luxury apartment buildings and so on. And finally, around 129th or 30th Street, it would go on a long viaduct, and then it would do a right turn back into the occupied area, and there you'd see the tenements. And I would wonder, why is this? I mean, why this huge disparity? And there was nobody else. There was no other explanation around. There was nothing there other than Marxism. I stumbled across it. I had not read Marx, but I bought a secondhand set of encyclopedias, small set, for some ridiculously low price. And I looked up Karl Marx. I'd heard the name, and the stuff that he said seemed to make sense. And then later on, I would get more and more into it. The argument was that the rich had gotten rich by taking from the poor.
Right.
And well, that was one explanation. But what is interesting, there was no other explanation out there really, and that's true largely in our colleges, universities today.
But so by the time you went to Harvard undergrad, you drop out at the age of 16, and you start reading Marx in your late teens.
I started reading Marx, yes, 1949, at age 19.
Age 19, and then you're in the Marine Corps for a couple of years. What was it? 2-3 years? 2
years. It was actually one year, 11 months, and 5 days. But who's counting?
But who's counting? All right. So by the time you went to Harvard, you had already become intellectually engaged with Marxism.
Yes.
And remained, and Harvard didn't talk you out of it, and the study of economics at Harvard didn't talk you out of it, nor did getting a master's at Columbia, nor did getting a doctorate at Chicago dissuade you from Marxism. Is that? And you studied with Milton Friedman of all people. How could you have sat in Milton Friedman's classroom and remained a Marxist?
Some people are just stubborn. What really changed me was not the University of Chicago. It was my first job working in a professional capacity for the government. I was a summer intern.
This is after Chicago? Or
No, while I was still a graduate student.
Got it.
And so during the summer vacation, I worked in the U.S. Department of Labor. And I began to realize, from a number of things, that the government is not simply the personification of the general will like Rousseau or others. The government is an the government institutions have their own institutional interests. One involved the minimum wage law. I was a big supporter of that. But I also knew that there was an argument that minimum wage laws simply priced low-wage workers out of a job. And my first assignment dealt with minimum wages in Puerto Rico. And as I looked at the numbers, I would see as they would jack up the minimum wages, the number of jobs would go down and so forth. But there were two explanations. One was that of the economists, that you priced the people out of a job. And the other was that there were hurricanes that had come through Puerto Rico, you see, during the sugar harvesting. and therefore, and I was studying the sugar industry, and therefore it destroyed a lot of the crop. Therefore, you wouldn't hire as many workers. Now, in Chicago, I had been taught that if there are two different theories, there should be some empirical evidence in principle that could distinguish what would happen under one theory from what would happen under the other.
Right.
And so I wrestled with that for most of the summer. And one morning I came in and I said, I got it. What we need are data on the amount of sugar cane standing in the fields before the hurricane struck. And as I waited for the congratulations, I could see stricken looks around me in the room. Like, this guy has stumbled on something that will ruin us all, you know? And they said, well, we don't have those data. I said, oh, I'll bet the Department of Agriculture has it. And he said, well, but that doesn't mean we have it. You'd have to have a request go up the chain of command to the Secretary of Labor. He would then confer with the Secretary of Agriculture. It would come down the chain of command in the Department of Agriculture to whoever has those numbers and so on. I said, good. Well, they say a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, so I will now submit my request to the Secretary of Labor, which I did. And I am still patiently awaiting this reply.
And the institutional fear of the number was what? That it would...
The U.S. Department of Labor administers the minimum wage law.
I see.
And the money and the careers of perhaps a third or some other significant percentage of the Labor Department's resources come from administering the minimum wage law. One of the real farces of all this is that the law itself, Section 4D, I still remember, requires the Labor Department to study the employment effects of minimum wages. And those studies are absolutely a farce. In fact, some years after I left, I did an article saying why those studies were a farce. And when I came back later on to the Labor Department to do some research, one of the older librarians who remembered me turned to the younger librarian and she said, this is the man who wrote that article that has everybody up in arms.
So you began to be dissuaded of Marxism.
And of government in general, because the government is not out there at the personification of the national interest.
Right.
They have their own interests, and the Labor Department was clearly an interest in keeping the minimum wage because that's their jobs and careers and power.
Which brings us, if I may, to one of my favorite books, your 2000 book. This is a beat-up old copy. Mm-hmm. This book, Conflict of Visions. Yes. Which you published in 2007, and you lay out. I'm sorry.
1987.
I beg your pardon, 1987.
Reprinted in 2007.
Well, beat up as this book is, it turns out this is a reprint, sorry. 1987, and you lay out two competing ways of looking at economics and politics, really two competing ways of looking at life that go back at least 200 years, the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision, I'm quoting from A Conflict of Visions, sees the evils of the world as deriving from the limited and unhappy choices available, given the inherent moral and intellectual limitations of human beings, close quote. So the constrained vision understands itself as constrained by the limitations of reality itself.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
In other words, they cannot proceed as so many do, that good things happen automatically, but bad things are somebody's fault.
Got it. Got it. And then to continue here, the constrained vision, again, quoting from A Conflict of Visions, for the amelioration, improvement of the human condition, the constrained vision relies on certain social processes such as moral traditions, the marketplace, or families, not government. So explain that. Why do we rely on processes rather than the will of the people instituting changes to improve our condition?
Well, it doesn't ignore government. Even for the market to work, you have to have a government, as Europe discovered when the Roman Empire collapsed, and the economies collapsed also. But I guess one of the reasons would be that with the government, you have surrogate decision makers, and they cannot possibly know as much as the individuals whose personal decisions have been preempted.
I see. I see. All right, which brings us to the unconstrained vision. When, again, I'm quoting you, when Rousseau said that man is born free but everywhere in chains, he expressed the essence of the unconstrained vision in which the fundamental problem is not nature or man, but institutions.
Yes.
Would you explain that one?
Well, he has the notion that, again, that good things happen naturally. And if they're bad things, it's because institutions, including civilization itself, have made these bad things happen. And of course, and I think that's really the implicit assumption behind a lot of things that are said on the left today. And why in my most recent book I go to a lot of trouble to show that in nature there's nothing resembling equal opportunity. That wherever you look around the country, around the world, you find people who live up in the mountains, poor and backwards, even in the richest countries, including the United States. Mm-hmm. I believe the poorest country in the United States, the county rather, was in a mountain community, which was almost 100% white.
Somewhere in Appalachia, West Virginia, Southern Ohio, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that men in that county had a life expectancy 10 years less than men in a county in Virginia.
And the unconstrained vision says, let's fix that. Surely we can pass a law that would improve that. And the constrained vision says, well, now wait a moment. If people who live in isolated pockets in mountains are poor and backwards all around the world, and we see this pattern over and over and over again, maybe there's something very deeply rooted in reality about that that's hard for us to get at. Correct?
Yes.
All right. So in the book, A Conflict of Visions.
All right, we've got to take a little commercial break, and after that, I'll be back with more America in Danger. Stay tuned.
Are you afraid to answer the phone because of bill collectors? A Chapter 13 plan can help. Chapter 13 allows people with too many bills to work out a debt repayment plan under federal law. It helps you control your debts instead of your debts controlling you. Chapter 13 stops creditors from harassing you and stops repossessions and foreclosures. It allows you to answer the phone again without fear or worry. Call H. Frank Allen, Attorney at Law, a debt relief agency providing bankruptcy relief under the Bankruptcy Code.
You're very dispassionate and very analytical, and you lay out the unconstrained vision, and you lay out the constrained vision, and you don't really come out blazing in favor of one or the other.
No, that is not a book meant to show that one vision is better than the other. It's there to show you what they are and what you're assuming if you go one direction or another.
Okay.
And it's to encourage people to understand the implicit assumptions behind all this, without which you're just at loose ends.
All right. So, pondering all this, I noticed something, a column that you wrote, this is a couple of years ago, in which you rebutted Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. And Kristof had ascribed the gaps between African Americans and whites in America, gaps in wealth, gaps in educational achievement, the usual gaps, to, and this is a quotation from Kristof, to the lingering effects of slavery, close quote.
Oh, yes.
And here's Tom Sowell, quote, if we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with hard evidence on the legacy of liberals, close quote. And so there it is, life is hard. You use the word hard. You use the word serious. You use evidence. Tom Sowell is a man of the constrained vision through and through and through, correct?
Yes.
No.
Yes, part of a vanishing breed, I might add.
So when you were a Marxist, The notion, explain that, because the Marxism.
Well, but no, you see,
yeah, so that's complicated.
Even when I was a Marxist, I had the same intellectual standards.
Right.
And that's what eventually led me away from it.
Oh, I see.
In other words, I hadn't done all the research. I hadn't gone around the world
looking for evidence.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So,
socialism is a great idea. That does not mean it's a great reality. One of the things that disturbs me tremendously is about this enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders and socialism at a time when people are literally starving in Venezuela, an oil-rich country. You know, and they're breaking into grocery stores to try to get food, and they're fleeing to neighboring countries, most of which are not all that prosperous themselves, but at least you don't starve to death in them. And none of that makes a bit of difference. Mm-hmm. I don't think most of these people who are out there cheering for Bernie Sanders have given a thought to Venezuela.
To the evidence.
That's right.
To the evidence.
Yes.
All right. Which brings us to something that you refer to in a number of columns as the retrogression, the experience of African Americans in this country. Economic progress, I'm quoting you. Despite the grand myth that black economic progress began or accelerated with the passage of the civil rights laws and the war on poverty programs of the 1960s, the fact is that the poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% in 1960. But over the next 20 years, the poverty rate among blacks fell another 18 percentage points. This was just the continuation of a previous economic trend, but at a slower rate of progress. It was not some grand deliverance, close quote. That is so counter to what we are taught in school, what appears on the editorial pages of newspapers, that I feel as though I want to ask you, you really want to stick with that assertion?
I have more evidence in my most recent book, Discrimination and Disparities. I point out that this really is a pattern not peculiar to blacks or even to the United States, that you can see the same thing in England, you can see it in any number of other countries, that the poor were much worse off economically, let's say in the first half of the 20th century, and yet in terms of their own behavior, they were far more decent societies, and afterwards, after this welfare state that's supposed to make them better off and better human beings, that's when the crime rate skyrocketed on both sides of the Atlantic. The British were famous for being perhaps the most polite, considerate society in the world. Prior to that. After that, you get things like the 2011 riots over there, went through London, Manchester, where they're going through this. They anticipated Ferguson and Baltimore by a few years. And the same thing is the burning down of buildings, the throwing of gasoline bombs, the whole smear. And none of those people were descendants of slaves.
So the poor people were doing, if the lesson of the 20th century is something like poor people, including in this country African Americans, were improving their lot and leading fundamentally decent lives until the government decided to help them.
Yeah, yes.
That's a fair statement.
Well, they're better off economically because of what's been given.
Right.
But of course, when you have the crime rate, I mean, I got the first inkling of this some years back when I was at some school in Harlem doing some research, and I had looked out the window and I mentioned in passing that when I was a little kid, I used to walk my dog in that park, and looks of horror came over the students' faces. Nobody in his right mind would have a child go into that park, walking a dog or not. The principal was warning these students not to cross this park, which is about a block and a half wide, even in groups of 6. And when I tell them about how in these hot summer nights I would sleep out on the fire escapes in Harlem, they looked at me like I was a man from Mars. People were doing that all over New York. They were doing it in Philadelphia, Washington, wherever I've known people. That was a common thing for poor people. We didn't have the money for air conditioning.
Right.
You slept out on the fire escape or in the parks. where Walter grew up in
Walter Williams.
Walter Williams grew up in a housing project in Philadelphia. He was saying on the hot summer nights, the people would be in this project would have little balconies. They'd sleep out on the balconies, and the ones on the first floor who didn't have balconies would sleep out in the yard. And that there were old men who you could see sit on a hot summer night, sitting outdoors into the wee hours playing cards or checkers or whatever. It was a different world.
It was a safe world.
And it was infinitely safer.
Now, what about family structure, Tom? Again, I'm quoting you. Most black children were being raised in two-parent families in 1960. 30 years after the liberal welfare state, the great majority of black children were being raised by single parents.
Yes.
How does that, by the way, we should note that Patrick Moynihan publishes the Moynihan Report in 1965.
Yes.
And he's alarmed because the illegitimacy rate among black families is 25% then. Now, among whites, it's over a third.
Yes.
Hispanics, it's over half. And among African Americans, it's over 70%. What's going on there?
Well, this is, again, this too, you find the same thing in Britain, you find it in France, in Norway, you find it in the Western world. In fact,
the dissolution of the family structure.
Oh, yeah, there are any number of Western nations where 40% of the children are raised with only one parent.
Right.
At the extremes, compared to Asian countries, at the extremes, Iceland, it's 2 out of 3 children born are raised in a single-parent home. In South Korea, it's 1 out of 66.
Wow. Wow. And so, that's the welfare state?
Yes,
it is.
Oh, you're paying. You're creating a situation where if the first of all, you're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, it will. And so they're paying. When you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
Right. Okay. So what would have happened if Lyndon Johnson, instead of becoming a liberal, had remained a crusty, tough, skeptical Texas conservative,
yes,
which is certainly the way he started his career? If Lyndon Johnson had embraced the constrained vision instead of instituting the war on poverty and the Great Society and so forth, what would the country look like today?
All right, I apologize for not being able to run the entire interview with Thomas Sowell. And if you want to see the rest of it, and I highly encourage you to do so, go to YouTube and search Thomas Sowell, The Myths of Inequality. Take a look at that. Now, next week we'll be back. My co-host John Gassis will be with me again. We'll be taking some calls, and we'll be talking about things that are currently happening in this nation. And as always, we're there to give you our perspective. So tune in every Saturday night, 6:30, here on WHIG-TV, Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I'm Robert Cressionnie. Have a good week.